My maid of honor vanished on my wedding day to elope with a man I'd introduced her to just 10 days prior, a man who turned out to be a con artist with a secret family in another state. For context, my wedding was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead, it became the day my entire family fractured because of my younger sister's impulsive and breathtakingly selfish decision. I, 29F, had always had a complicated relationship with my sister, Hannah, who is 25. We love each other fiercely, but our clashes are legendary. I'm a planner, a researcher, someone who needs to have all the facts before making a move. Hannah, on the other hand, lives on impulse and emotion. She's the free spirit to my structured organizer. Our arguments would get nuclear, but we always found our way back to each other, bound by a deep, unshakable, if often tested, sisterly bond. When my long-term boyfriend David and I got engaged after 5 years together, we planned a small, elegant wedding on the coast of Maine. I didn't want a big bridal party. David and I are both introverts, and the idea of managing a group of bridesmaids felt exhausting. My parents, however, were adamant that I include Hannah. They argue it would be a beautiful gesture to mend our recent, particularly nasty fight over borrowing and subsequently damaging a vintage dress of mine. They wore me down with their vision of sisterly unity. Reluctantly, I asked Hannah to be my maid of honor. She accepted with surprising enthusiasm, and for a few months, it was wonderful. We bonded over cake tastings and dress shopping. I foolishly let myself believe we had finally turned a corner. The trouble started at our engagement barbecue, a casual gathering at our rented beach house 2 weeks before the wedding. We had invited David's extended family, including his uncle Robert and Aunt Carol. We did not invite their son, Ben. Ben, 35, was a charmer with a shady reputation. David knew stories from his youth of Ben being involved in various get-rich-quick schemes that always left others holding the bag. He was a slick talker who could sell ice to an Eskimo, but his charm was as deep as a puddle. To our annoyance, Robert and Carol brought Ben along anyway. Not wanting to cause a scene, we gritted our teeth and let it slide. I noticed Hannah and Ben talking animatedly by the fire pit for most of the evening. There was a lot of laughter, and he seemed to be hanging on her every word. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. I knew Ben's type was exactly what Hannah found irresistible. Older, seemingly worldly, and dangerously charming. I made a mental note to talk to her about him later, to warn her. But in the flurry of final wedding preparations, vendor confirmations, and guest list dramas, the note got lost in the shuffle. I dismissed it as a harmless flirtation. After the barbecue, David's father had a firm word with his brother, making it crystal clear that Ben was not welcome at the wedding. We assumed the matter was closed. What we didn't know was that Hannah and Ben had exchanged numbers. They began texting and calling constantly. Hannah, caught up in the whirlwind romance, kept a secret. She later told me she thought I would judge her or kill her vibe. Ben, it turns out, was laying on the charm thick. He painted himself as a successful entrepreneur between ventures, driving a fancy car, a rental, as we later discovered, and taking her to expensive restaurants, probably on credit. He told her he'd never felt a connection like this before. He was a master storyteller, and Hannah was his most willing audience. 5 days before my wedding, the idea was planted. Ben, with his silver tongue, began romanticizing the idea of an elopement. He called it the ultimate adventure. He said getting married on the same day as her sister would be poetic, and a story they'd tell their grandchildren. He made it sound like a rebellious, romantic fairy tale, and Hannah, in her state of infatuation, bought every word. On the morning of my wedding, as I was having my hair and makeup done with my mother in the bridal suite, Hannah was nowhere to be found. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Panic set in. We called hotels, friends, anyone we could think of. Finally, A hotel staff member confirmed she had checked out late the previous night. The devastation was absolute. My maid of honor, my own sister, had ghosted me on my wedding day. I was humiliated, heartbroken, and furious. With Dave and my parents' support, I decided the show must go on. I walked down the aisle alone, putting on a brave face for our guests, my heart feeling like a stone in my chest. The joy of the day was permanently shadowed by her absence. The betrayal cut deeper that evening. As our wedding reception was winding down, Hannah and Ben showed up, beaming, hands adorned with matching gold bands. They announced they were married. They had driven to a kitschy, 24-hour wedding chapel in a neighboring state and tied the knot that very afternoon. My initial shock quickly morphed into white-hot rage. Hannah had the audacity to expect me to be happy for her, to celebrate her love story. The confrontation was explosive. I told her she was selfish and reckless, and that she had irrevocably damaged our relationship. She screamed that I was a joyless control freak who couldn't stand to see her happy. Ben stood there with a smug, triumphant look that made my skin crawl. They stormed out, and I resolved to cut her out of my life for good. For 3 weeks, there was silence. David and I settled into married life, trying to forget the whole ugly incident. Then, one rainy Tuesday night, Hannah showed up on our doorstep, alone, her face puffy from crying. She was a wreck. The fairy tale had crumbled into a nightmare almost immediately. Ben, it turned out, was not a successful entrepreneur. He was deeply in debt. The fancy apartment he'd taken her to was a friend's. His actual home was a cramped, messy studio in a terrible part of town. But the most shocking revelation came next. Hannah had discovered, entirely by accident, that Ben was not only already married, but he had a wife and 2 young children living in a town just 2 hours away. The marriage license they obtained was a complete sham, as he was legally unable to marry her. He had been juggling 2 lives, and Hannah's impulsive elopement had threatened to topple his entire house of cards. When she confronted him, the charming facade vanished, replaced by a cold, manipulative bully. He told her she was naive and that she was stuck with him now. She had packed a bag and fled while he was at one of his business meetings, likely a visit to his actual family. Sitting on my couch, sobbing, she begged for my help. She needed a lawyer, and she knew I worked at a prestigious legal firm. She wanted to sue him for fraud, for emotional distress, for everything he had put her through. She expected me, her sister, to take on her case. I am a corporate lawyer, not a litigator, and the personal conflict of interest would have been astronomical. I looked at her, this sister of mine who had caused me so much pain, and I felt a complex mix of pity and resentment. I told her, as gently as I could but with firm resolve, that I could not be her lawyer. I would help her find an excellent family law attorney who could advise her on the annulment, since the marriage was void anyway, and possibly connect her with someone who could explore legal action for the fraud he committed against her. But I would not be leading the charge. Her face crumpled, not in understanding, but in fresh anger. The victim quickly became the accuser. "You knew," she shrieked. "You saw him at the barbecue. You knew what he was like, and you said nothing. This is your fault. If you had just warned me, none of this would have happened." I was stunned into silence. She was rewriting history, shifting the blame for her catastrophic choices onto my shoulders. We argued in circles for an hour. She claimed I had set her up for failure because I was jealous of her spontaneity. She demanded I fix this for her, for free, as penance for my supposed negligence. Her entitlement was breathtaking. I finally had to threaten to call the police to get her to leave my house. The harassment began immediately. Dozens of texts, voicemails from unknown numbers, long, rambling emails blaming me for her ruined life. My parents, when I called them, were no support. They took her side, saying she was heartbroken and taken advantage of, and that my coldness was just making it worse. They accused me of victim blaming. I felt utterly alone, trapped in a narrative where I was a villain for refusing to clean up a mess I didn't make. The constant barrage from Hannah continued for 4 days. I was losing my mind. I decided to go to my parents' house after work to draw a firm boundary. I knew Hannah was staying with them, as she had nowhere else to go. When I arrived, she slammed the door in my face. My mother eventually let me in, and we sat in the living room while Hannah sulked in her old bedroom. I laid it all out for my parents. The constant calls, the emotional blackmail, the absolute unfairness of it all. My parents listened, but their response crushed me. They revealed they had already hired a lawyer for Hannah and were proceeding with the annulment. They admitted they thought her lawsuit for damages was a long shot, but they were humoring her. Then came the kicker. They told me Hannah's relentless campaign wasn't really about legal help anymore. It was about an apology. My apology. She genuinely believed I shared the blame for not pulling her aside at the barbecue and giving her a full dossier on Ben's life. They said that as the older, more responsible sister, it was my duty to have been looking out for her, and my failure to do so made me partially responsible for the consequences. I lost my composure. I yelled that I was not Hannah's keeper, that she was a 25-year-old woman who made a conscious choice to ditch her own sister's wedding, and that their coddling was a reason she never faced consequences for anything. The conversation devolved into a screaming match. My father told me I had a cold heart, and that my career had made me forget what family means. They asked me to leave. I drove home in tears, feeling like a stranger in my own family. David was my only rock, reaffirming that I was not crazy, and my boundaries were not only reasonable but necessary for my own sanity. Update 2. For 2 weeks, there was a heavy, painful silence. I focused on my work and my new marriage, trying to heal. David and I were planning a belated honeymoon trip to Italy, and I threw myself into the research, a comforting return to my methodical nature. I miss my family terribly, but the injustice of their accusations kept me from reaching out. I knew if I apologized, I would be betraying myself and accepting a burden of guilt that was not mine to carry. One evening, I came home from work to find David's car in the driveway, along with my parents and another I recognized as Hannah's. My stomach dropped. I braced myself for another confrontation as I walked inside. But the scene that greeted me was nothing I could have prepared for. Hannah, her eyes red-rimmed but clear, stood up the moment I entered. Without a word, she walked over and wrapped her arms around me in a tight, desperate hug. I stood stiffly for a moment. Then, feeling the familiar weight of sisterly history, I hugged her back, tears welling in my own eyes. When we finally pulled apart, the floodgates opened. "I'm so sorry," she choked out. "I was so wrong. About everything." She explained that the reality of what she had done had finally sunk in. The initial shock and victimhood had worn off, leaving her with the stark, humiliating truth of her own poor judgment. She told me she had been looking for someone to blame, because the alternative, accepting that she had been so easily duped and had so deeply hurt her family, was too painful to face. She said, "I was an idiot, and I tried to make you pay for my mistake. There's no excuse." My parents then spoke, their voices thick with emotion. They apologized for not seeing the situation clearly. They admitted they had always babied Hannah because of her sensitive nature, and in doing so, they had failed both of us, her by not teaching her accountability, and me by always expecting me to be the understanding, forgiving one. They said my refusal to play that role this time had forced them to see the dynamic clearly for the first time. It was a raw, honest, and deeply emotional conversation that lasted for hours. We cried, we talked, and for the first time in years, we truly listened to each other. I didn't fully forgive them in that moment. The wounds were too fresh, but I saw their remorse was genuine. I agreed to try, to give our family a second chance. Hannah updated us on the annulment. It was proceeding smoothly, and she had dropped a far-fetched lawsuit. She acknowledged it was a misguided attempt to regain a sense of control. As they were leaving, my father pressed an envelope into my hand. Inside was a generous check, more than enough to cover our flights to Italy. They said it was a small token to try and make up for the honeymoon stress they had contributed to. It was a gesture of good faith, and I accepted it, feeling a fragile but real sense of hope. It has been almost 3 years since that emotional night in my living room. David and I have settled into a happy, peaceful life. The journey to rebuild trust with my family was slow and required conscious effort from everyone, especially Hannah. There were stumbles, old patterns that tried to reassert themselves, but we worked through them. The biggest change has been in Hannah. The experience, as brutal as it was, forced her to grow up. She went back to school, finished her degree, and now has a stable job she loves. She's still more spontaneous than I am, but it's now a thoughtful spontaneity, not a reckless one. 2 months ago, David and I found out we are expecting our first child. The joy this news has brought our family is immeasurable. My parents are over the moon, but the most touching reaction came from Hannah. She cried happy tears when I told her. She had become my most devoted prenatal supporter, bringing me ginger tea for morning sickness, sending me articles, and already planning a sensible but fabulous baby shower. She told me, her voice full of emotion, "I'm going to be the best aunt this kid could ever have. I'm going to be the fun, cool aunt who also teaches him about boundaries and personal responsibility." We both laughed, but I knew she meant every word. Giving my family a second chance was the hardest, but ultimately the best decision I could have made. The fracture led to a rebuilding, and what was rebuilt is stronger and more honest than what was there before. My child will be born into a family that has learned, through pain and forgiveness, what it truly means to love and support one another, not in spite of our flaws, but with a full understanding of them. The future, for all of us, finally feels bright.